It begins with the sound. A distant metallic thunder rolling across the cold Atlantic air, not from guns, not from engines, but from something deeper, the rumble of a world shifting its weight. The date is January 23, 1944, and somewhere off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, a gray morning fog hangs low over the sea like a curtain about to rise on an unexpected stage. A U.S. troop transport ship edges toward harbor, its hull groaning under the subtle change in current as gulls circle above, their cries lost beneath the rhythmic thumping of diesel engines. Below deck, pressed against steel bulkheads still salted from the crossing, over 2,000 German prisoners of war sit in uneasy silence. Some clutch their duffel sacks. Some stare blankly at the floor. A few steel themselves with a rigid posture, refusing to show curiosity, fear, or wonder. And yet, even here, under dim red lamps that sway with the ship's movement, they cannot escape the truth. They are crossing into the land they had been told was decadent, weak, disordered, a nation of amateurs. But the sound they hear above them tells a different story. As the fog thins, the first outlines of Hampton Roads Naval Base emerge like industrial monoliths, cranes as tall as church steeples, drydocks wide enough to swallow ships whole, and rail lines glinting with the promise of endless cargo. It is a sight none of them expected to see. Not here, not in the America their officers had described, a nation supposedly too soft-hearted, too fractured, too undisciplined to stand against the Reich's iron will. Many of these men had served on the Eastern Front, in France or over the skies of Europe. They had seen destruction, smoke, desperation. But what rises before the ship now is something else entirely. A landscape not of war but of unstoppable production. And in that moment, before they even touch American soil, the contradiction that shapes this entire story becomes clear. The world thought these men were defeated. But in truth, they were about to witness the power that had already defeated them. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as a country incapable of war on an industrial scale, a place where factories were scattered, where workers were undisciplined, where politics made unity impossible. Many German soldiers believed these claims, absorbing them as unquestioned fact. But as the transport ship glides into the cavernous embrace of the Norfolk docks, they begin to see the first cracks in that carefully constructed illusion. Steel cranes move like mechanical giants. Rail cars sit lined in perfect rows. Warehouses stretch beyond the horizon. And everywhere, motion. This is not the America they imagined. This is the America that built 100,000 aircraft, 60,000 tanks, and 6,000 warships in a single year. This is the America of Ford's Willow Run, where a B-24 Liberator rolls off the assembly line every 55 minutes. This is the America of women welders, black truck battalions, migrant farm labor, and immigrant machinists, all fused into a single engine of production unlike anything seen in human history. And these German POWs, who left their homeland convinced that industrial might belonged only to the Reich, now step into a lesson they will never forget. The gangplank lowers, a nation reveals itself. As the ship docks, the prisoners rise. Some lean forward, pushing to see out of the narrow portholes. Others force themselves to look away, refusing to show interest. But curiosity, the universal weakness of soldiers taken from the battlefield, wins out again and again. The gangplank slams down. A gust of crisp American winter air rushes into the hold, carrying with it the smell of oil, coal smoke, and something else. Movement without chaos. Trucks rumble past in orderly lines. Military police stand in crisp formation. Civilian factory workers stride briskly between warehouses, lunch pails in hand, as if unaware of the war raging across the ocean. One prisoner, a 24-year-old infantryman from Cologne, whispers to the man beside him, "If this is only one harbor, what does the rest of this country look like?" The question hangs unanswered in the air as they descend, because the truth is, not even American officials fully grasp the enormity of what their nation has become in wartime. These POWs, most of whom assumed they would be marched into bleak camps or crumbling military bases, instead find themselves transported into a sprawling logistical apparatus. Trains wait for them, long, endless, freshly painted troop trains, ready to move them deep into the American interior. And every mile they travel will chip away at the myths they once believed. Two worlds collide. This story is not merely about captured soldiers and the nation that holds them. It is about the collision of two worldviews. Germany, which believed war was won through discipline, blood, and ideological purity. America, which believed war was won through production, innovation, and the collective power of millions. It is a clash of Centralized authority versus decentralized creativity, rigid hierarchy versus industrial democracy, romantic militarism versus pragmatic logistics. In Europe, German POWs had seen ruins, cities crushed by Allied bombs, factories reduced to skeletons. They had marched past hungry civilians, bombed out rail lines, and endless shortages. They understood the cost of total war better than most. But what they would witness in America was not ruin but abundance, not chaos but order, not austerity but a machine of production so vast, so disciplined, so relentless that it makes clear why the war's outcome was already written long before these men boarded their transport ships. Historical context. The numbers behind the wonder. By the time the first major waves of German POWs arrived in 1944, the United States had already done the impossible. In 1939, America ranked 19th in military strength. By 1944, it was producing half of all weapons used by the Allies. The U.S. economy, once sluggish from the Great Depression, had surged to produce more steel, more aircraft, more ammunition, and more vehicles than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. Over 425,000 German prisoners would eventually be held in roughly 700 camps scattered across the United States, an entire shadow nation hidden within another nation. To the German soldiers marching down American train platforms, this was incomprehensible. They had been taught that their homeland was the pinnacle of order and engineering, that American society was fragmented and crude. But as they traveled deeper into the United States, past endless miles of farmland, past factory towns where smokestacks painted the sky gray, past rail yards stacked with freight cars loaded with material, they realized something profound. America wasn't just fighting the war. America was manufacturing victory. The misconception that defines the story. For German POWs, the greatest shock was not defeat. It was the realization that they had never truly understood their enemy. They had expected a nation unprepared for war. They found a society mobilized with breathtaking efficiency. They had expected poverty and disorganization. They found prosperity and order. They had expected indifference. They found determination. And beneath all of this was the quietest truth of all, a truth that will echo through this entire documentary. The real battlefield was not in Europe, but in the factories, the rail yards, the foundries, and the assembly lines of America. These POWs arrived as prisoners of war, but many would leave transformed witnesses to the magnitude of America's industrial civilization. Their memories, captured later in diaries, oral histories, and interviews, reveal a common echo. We did not lose the war in the trenches. We lost it in the machine shops of the United States. A story of power and humanity. This documentary explores not only the scale of American production, but the human experience of those who saw it firsthand. The story unfolds across two continents, weaving together. The sailors who guarded POW transports, the factory workers who forged the weapons, the towns that hosted POW camps, the architects of America's industrial mobilization, and the prisoners themselves, whose beliefs were reshaped by what they witnessed. It is a story of ideological collision and technological transformation, but also of unexpected dignity. Moments when humanity pierced through the hatred of war. The turning point of a century. As those German prisoners step off the ship in Norfolk, they do not yet know how their lives will change. They do not yet know that many will work on American farms, helping harvest wheat and cotton. They do not know that some will be shocked by how well they are fed or how fairly they are treated. They do not know that they will see factories producing more aircraft in a month than Germany could in a year. They do not know that this journey will reshape their understanding of power for the rest of their lives. But that is the journey this documentary will reveal, step by step, mile by mile, factory by factory. Thesis statement. What this story reveals. This is the story of how German POWs, taken from the front lines of a collapsing Reich, entered the heart of an industrial democracy whose strength they had never imagined, and how what they saw transformed their understanding of war, power, and civilization itself. This story reveals that the greatest force in war is not the army that marches, but the society that builds, and that sometimes the most profound victories occur not through domination, but through revelation. German POWs were amazed by America's industrial power after arriving in the United States. Before the revelation, misconceptions, propaganda, and the hidden engine of war. Before the first German prisoner ever stepped onto American soil, the Reich had already constructed a wall of illusions around them. Illusions built from ideology, selective truth, and the arrogance of a regime convinced of its industrial invincibility. German soldiers were told that America was a nation of consumers, not producers. A place where politics were chaotic, workers lazy, factories outdated, and engineers inferior. It was a narrative repeated in barracks, printed in newspapers, whispered by officers who themselves did not understand the truth. The German High Command believed they held an advantage. A tradition of engineering excellence and centralized authority. America, in their view, possessed neither. They imagined a nation hopelessly fractured by geography, too large to mobilize, too diverse to unite, too democratic to sacrifice. Their analyses, written in Berlin's war rooms, described American society as incapable of sustaining protracted conflict. But even before the United States entered the war, these assessments were already outdated. In 1939, while Europe leaned into militarism, America leaned into industry. As German soldiers rolled into Poland, the U.S. quietly expanded shipyards, opened new aircraft plants, and poured money into the tools of production. While the Reich fractured its resources across fronts, America consolidated its power into something utterly unique. A war machine disguised as a civilian economy. Yet to the German infantrymen captured in Tunisia, Sicily, Normandy, and the Hürtgen Forest, this reality was invisible. They had lived through shortages, rationing, and the visible strain on German industry. They saw factories bombed, trains destroyed, and resources dwindling. They had no frame of reference to imagine a nation where steel mills burned 24 hours a day or trains stretched for miles, women welded hull plates and shifts, highways became supply arteries, and assembly lines built wings, engines, and fuselages simultaneously. To them this was impossible. That impossibility would soon become the central revelation of their captivity. Arrival and the first shock. America reveals its scale. The turning point arrived not through battle but through travel. From the moment German POWs first touched U.S. soil, the American logistical system, vast, efficient, and almost casual in its scale, began unveiling itself. 1. The rail journey into the interior. The trains that carried them from coastal bases were unlike anything they had imagined. Not overcrowded cattle wagons but long, steel passenger cars fitted for military movement. Even the guards seemed surprised at how smoothly everything functioned. At the Norfolk rail yards, POWs watched in stunned silence as dozens of freight trains rumbled through simultaneously. Cranes unloaded cargo and synchronized motion trucks lined up with mathematical precision. Workers moved with clinical efficiency. The Germans quietly counted the locomotives, noting their size and condition. Many came from cities where a single undamaged train engine had become a rarity. But America had thousands and they were all in motion. As the trains snaked westward, the POWs witnessed a landscape that felt endless. Fields that stretched beyond the horizon. Small towns with bustling depots. Factories whose chimneys dyed the sky gray. Warehouses the size of city blocks. Trucks, always trucks, flowing like blood cells through a circulatory system of roads. One prisoner later recalled. The country was a machine and we were moving inside it. 2. America's internal front. The arsenal they did not know existed. To German POWs, nothing was more astonishing than how normal American production appeared. They expected a nation strained by war. Instead they saw one invigorated by it. In Michigan they passed near Willow Run, the Liberator plant, where Henry Ford produced a bomber every 55 minutes. In Illinois, they saw train yards stacked with Sherman tanks like rows of green steel animals waiting to be unleashed. In Pennsylvania, the glow of Pittsburgh's steel mills painted the night sky orange, as if the horizon itself were burning in support of the war effort. In Iowa, endless rows of grain fields revealed how America fed not only its own troops, but its allies, and now even its prisoners. The more they traveled, the more the illusion of Germany's superiority dissolved. They began to grasp something their officers never wanted them to understand. America was not just fighting a war. America was manufacturing victory at a level Germany could never match. Inside the camps, observations, conflicts, and the human reaction. When the POWs finally reached the camps, from Texas to Kansas, from Colorado to Georgia, they expected brutality or chaos. They found neither. 1. Order without oppression. American POW camps were highly organized, almost startlingly so. Barbed wire, guard towers, neat rows of wooden barracks, kitchens, infirmaries, recreation fields. Everything was built with the same industrial logic the prisoners had glimpsed on the journey. The Americans enforced discipline but rarely cruelty. Rules were strict but systems worked. Punishment was legalistic, not brutal. This alone contradicted everything they had been told. 2. The first clash, pride versus reality. Some prisoners clung to their indoctrination, insisting Germany still held industrial superiority. They boasted of jet fighters, V-2 rockets, the mechanical precision of German warplanes. But reality intruded. The lunches served in the camps often surpassed the rations German soldiers received on the front. The Americans even complied with the Geneva Convention's requirement that prisoners be fed the same diet as U.S. troops. One prisoner, a former Luftwaffe mechanic, wrote in his diary, "If our people at home ate like this, the war would last a century." Another German officer scoffed at American technological inferiority, until he saw a train unload hundreds of Dodge trucks destined for the Red Ball Express. His whispered admission was overheard by others. "They build more trucks in a week than we do in months." For some, the confrontation was not physical, it was ideological. 3. The guards and the prisoners. Conversations inevitably began between German POWs and American soldiers or civilian employees. Sometimes carefully. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes in the open once trust formed. The Germans asked questions, the kind they were not supposed to ask. How many men built this camp? How many factories does America have? How many workers build tanks? How many planes can you produce? The answers stunned them. Some had believed Germany produced more aircraft than any other nation. They soon learned America outproduced them 5-1. Some believed the U-boats were crippling Allied logistics. They soon realized America was building ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. Their worldview, once rigid and unquestioning, began to bend. 4. The silent competition. Work, skill, identity. Many POWs were assigned to labor details under the Geneva Convention, primarily agricultural work, forestry, or non-military industry. And here another confrontation took place. German pride in craftsmanship versus American mastery of mass production. German prisoners often admired American machines. Tractors that never broke down, combines that harvested in half the time, engines that seemed overpowered yet reliable, tools built for speed rather than perfection. One POW carpenter summed it up. "In Germany we perfect one hammer. In America they make a million." This was not merely an observation, it was a psychological fracture. They began to understand why Germany was losing the war. Voices from the camps. Diaries, letters, and moments of quiet realization. This section of the documentary zooms in, drawing close to individual fragments, voices that survived long after the war ended. 1. A diary from Camp Hearn, Texas. A German NCO wrote, "The Americans do not fear scarcity. They do not fear disorder. Their land is too big for fear and their factories too many." He added, "I think our officers lied to us. Or maybe they simply did not know the truth." 2. A letter from a German artilleryman in Kansas. "The children here play with model airplanes made from metal. At home, even our soldiers struggle to find enough." He ends with a confession. "I do not know what Germany is fighting anymore. We cannot win against a country that makes everything in such numbers." 3. A conversation recalled decades later. A German POW spoke with an American farmer during harvest season. "Oh, how many tractors does your county have?" Farmer: "Hundreds, I suppose." "Oh, in my whole region in Bavaria we had 3. It was not meant as humiliation, just truth. Yet the truth was more devastating than any battlefield loss. 4. The moment of realization. One prisoner, a former tank crewman, watched a convoy of American military vehicles pass by a Kansas road. "I saw more trucks in those 10 minutes than the entire German army had left." Such moments accumulated until the ideological armor they had brought from Europe cracked open. How America's industrial power reshaped the POWs' beliefs and Germany's fate. As months turned into years, German POWs became witnesses to a scale of industrialization no propaganda could conceal. 1. Quantifying the shock. The numbers told a story more brutal than any guard. America produced 300,000 aircraft, Germany about 120,000. America built over 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles. Germany, less than half. America constructed thousands of ships. Germany lost more U-boats than it could replace. America supplied 70% of the Allies' vehicles. America fed not only its own troops but the British, the Soviets, and millions of civilians. The POWs saw the consequences firsthand. A society unbroken. A factory system untouched. A warhead of production aimed at Berlin. 2. Psychological impact. For many POWs, the revelation was devastating. They felt betrayed by their own leadership, by the illusions of Nazi propaganda, by the promises of superiority that now sounded hollow. Some felt awe, even admiration. Some felt despair. Some felt shame. But almost all felt something deeper. Clarity. They understood that this war, their war, had been lost long before Allied troops set foot in Normandy. 3. Ideological collapse. The more they saw, the more they understood. Germany's rigid central planning could not match America's flexible industrial democracy. German craftsmanship could not compete with American mass production. German sacrifice could not compensate for American abundance. One prisoner summarized it better than any historian. We lost not because we fought badly, but because our enemy built better than we ever imagined. What the POWs learned, and how it reframed the war. By the end of their captivity, many German POWs underwent a profound transformation, not merely political or emotional but civilizational. They saw a society that was powerful without being tyrannical, unified without terror, industrious without oppression. They met guards who treated them fairly, civilians who spoke freely, workers who took pride in production without fear of punishment. They learned something their leaders never understood. America's strength lay not in ideology but in capacity. Not in uniformity but in diversity. Not in military power but in industrial civilization. When German POWs returned home after the war, many carried the same message. We were defeated before we arrived in America. We just didn't know it yet. They had witnessed what historians now agree was the decisive factor of World War II. The arsenal of democracy, an industrial colossus capable of reshaping the entire world order. And for the POWs who walked through that colossus, one realization remained. They had not just lost a war. They had misjudged a civilization. What the POWs carried home, and what the world learned from their astonishment. As the war ended and the last German prisoners prepared for repatriation, a strange quiet settled over the camps. The guard towers still stood, the fences still glimmered with barbed wire in the morning frost, and the fields where POWs once labored slowly emptied. The trains that had carried them into the heart of a foreign land would now carry them out again, back across oceans and ruins to a Germany they no longer fully recognized, nor fully trusted. For many, this final journey felt heavier than the one that had brought them to America. Back then they were soldiers, believers, instruments of a regime convinced of its dominance. Now they were witnesses, observers, men who had seen a world their leaders had hidden from them. In the quiet moments before departure, some prisoners walked along the fences one last time, looking toward the horizon as if trying to memorize the colors of a sky that had never known the dark silhouette of Allied bombers. Others sat in silence, their hands folded, their eyes distant, replaying the unforgettable images etched into their memories. The trains, the factories, the cities of steel, the endless roads where machines outnumbered men. They had arrived as enemies of America. They left as students of it. The aftermath, a broken homeland and a changed mind. When these men stepped back onto German soil, they found a country physically defeated, but also ideologically exhausted. Cities lay in ruins. Rail lines twisted like broken spines. Factories that once symbolized pride now stood as skeletal reminders of a war Germany could no longer afford, and had never truly understood. For many returning POWs, it was not merely the destruction that shocked them. It was the contrast. After seeing American industrial abundance, fields that overflowed, railroads that multiplied, machines that seemed forged without limit, the scarcity of post-war Germany felt surreal, even painful. Housewives lined up for bread, ration books determined meals, and entire neighborhoods survived in makeshift shelters carved between mountains of rubble. One former POW from a camp in Oklahoma described the moment he returned to Munich. I felt as if I had traveled from the future into the past. America's factories had been roaring. Germany's were silent. America's roads stretched unbroken. Germany's were severed. America's society had been mobilized without being militarized. Germany's had been militarized without being modernized. The war had shown them two different civilizations, and only one of them had survived intact. The moral irony, the defeated who learned, the victors who paid. History is rarely generous with its lessons, and never gentle in delivering them. The irony of this story, its moral twist, is that Germany's prisoners learned more in captivity than many of their leaders learned in power. As enemies of the United States, they were introduced to American values not by propaganda, but by proximity. They saw a nation where power did not always require fear, where leadership was earned rather than imposed, and where industry served society instead of dominating it. Meanwhile, America, the victorious giant, carried burdens invisible to the prisoners who marveled at its strength. The weight of maintaining global stability, the cost of sustaining military bases around the world, the moral strain of fighting future wars with the same industrial apparatus, the emerging anxiety of a superpower whose rivals would eventually seek weapons far more destructive than tanks or planes. Victory, they learned, was never simple. And power always came with a price. The legacy, a new Germany built from contradictions. In the decades that followed, many former POWs became quietly influential voices in rebuilding West Germany. Their memories of American industry, fairness, and organizational efficiency shaped their approach to work, politics, and society. Historians often overlook this, but letters and interviews from the 1950s and 1960s reveal a recurring theme. The POWs helped rebuild Germany with ideas they learned in captivity. Some became engineers, inspired by the scale of American production. Some became farmers, adopting the machinery and agricultural methods they had first handled as forced laborers in American fields. Others went into politics, promoting democratic norms they observed in the camp councils allowed by U.S. administrators. One former Wehrmacht sergeant, later a successful automobile engineer, described his transformation. In America I saw the future. In Germany I helped build it. This was the true legacy of their astonishment. A generation of men shaped by defeat, who used lessons from captivity to rebuild a nation stronger than the one they had once served. The technological revelation. Why industry won the war. The story of these POWs reveals something deeper than surprise or admiration. It exposes the underlying truth of World War II. Technology alone did not win the war. Production did. Logistics did. Civilization did. Germany built impressive machines. But America built them in numbers. Germany engineered precision weapons. But America engineered supply chains. Germany bet on brilliance. America bet on scale. In the end, scale proved stronger. This is the lesson every German POW eventually confronted. Some reluctantly, some with awe, some with fear. A modern war is not decided by the skill of a soldier, but by the strength of the society standing behind him. And in this contest of civilizations, the United States possessed an industrial power unlike anything the world had ever seen. Across interviews conducted decades later, one image surfaced again and again. An image so simple yet so overwhelming that thousands of former POWs recalled it with almost reverent clarity. It was not a B-17 skimming the clouds. Not a Sherman tank rumbling across a training field. Not a shipyard in full roar. It was the sight of endless freight trains crossing the American Midwest. Train after train after train. Car after car loaded with steel, food, fuel, trucks, aircraft parts, ammunition. The lifeblood of a global war effort streaming through a landscape untouched by destruction. One POW said, "When I saw those trains, I understood the war was over, even though the fighting had not yet ended." To him, those trains were not just machines. They were a prophecy. A vision of a world in which power no longer came from armies alone, but from assembly lines, logistics, and the capacity to sustain conflict without being consumed by it. Those POWs had walked into the heart of the American industrial empire, and realized it had the strength to shape the century that followed. In the end, the story of German POWs in America is not merely the tale of prisoners marveling at factories, railroads, and machinery. It is a story about the nature of power itself. Power is not noise. It is not spectacle. It is not ideology, nor propaganda, nor pride. Power is capacity. Power is organization. Power is the will of a society harnessed with purpose. Germany fought with fury, discipline, and conviction. But America fought with infrastructure. And despite all the myths of superiority that the Reich once proclaimed, it was infrastructure, not ideology, that determined the outcome. The POWs learned this lesson in the most unexpected way. Not as warriors but as witnesses. Not in victory but in captivity. And from their astonishment emerged a truth that resonates far beyond the war that shaped it. The greatest force in human conflict is not the army on the field, but the civilization that stands behind it. As the camera of history pulls back, past the camps, past the battlefields, past the ruined cities of Europe and the towering factories of America, one final realization remains. In the end, the story of these POWs is not about defeat or triumph, but about revelation. Because when they stepped into the United States, they saw something their leaders had never shown them. A society where freedom fueled industry, where diversity strengthened unity, where prosperity armed democracy, and where ordinary citizens built extraordinary power. This was the lesson that endured long after the fences came down. The lesson that shaped a new Germany. The lesson that defined a new world. The lesson that still echoes today. In the end, they discovered that freedom itself was the most powerful weapon.